Thank you all for coming this morning. I really appreciate it. Uh, I really want this to be a fairly informal conversation. And my goal here is to provide answers, at least to the best of my ability, that you might be facing as a founder or as a team lead, as someone in a technical or a non technical position. I want to be a resource to you. So if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can dive in to any questions you might have. Now, the way I've structured this is the first probably 10, 15 minutes, kind of talk through some common questions that I get from founders, both technical founders and non-technical founders, and then open up the floor. So if any folks have any questions that they would like to have answered, I'm here to try and answer those or to point you in a good direction. And if at any point you have trouble hearing or understanding, seeing the slide presentation, please let me know, and I'll try and address any issues as we get going. But so again, thank you all for being here this morning. This webinar is designed to try and answer common questions that I get from founders that focus on technical aspects of their companies. So typically companies that I work with are developing custom software to solve some business problem. A lot of times this is either internal applications that companies are subscribing to, or it may be a SaaS offering that has a subscription model. Either one, the common questions tend to be the same, and that's what I wanted to highlight here today. So it's likely we haven't met before, but my name is Brian Childress. I'm located in Virginia, and I work as an architect, as a fractional CTO, and as a technical advisor. I've enjoyed working with startups for well over a decade. And in that time, I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of companies in a lot of different verticals facing what tends to be very similar challenges from a technology standpoint. Now, I've worked with or for companies that you might recognize, like Calendly or Capital One. And in that time, I've had an opportunity to work on a number of really fun and interesting technical challenges. And at the end of the day, one of the biggest things that I found is that technology is the easiest part of what we do. In business, it tends to be a lot more challenging when we bring in people and communication. And in the world that we live in now, as we're much more geographically dispersed, this can be more challenging. But my goal here today is to really focus in on the technical pieces. So now just kind of setting the stage, as a founder, I think it's our job to create a vision for the future, something that can inspire and engage others within our organization, something that we can look forward to. Now, that vision in the early days may be 6 months out or 18 months, but really it's the founder's goal or role in the organization to set that long-term vision. And it's important to have a fairly clear vision of where we're headed, because that can help inform a lot of the technology decisions that we make today. Now, it's also our job to explain why this next feature, customer, or phase will help us to achieve that vision. If we understand what is it that we're doing today and how does that impact the future, it's much easier for us to make better technology decisions. It's also our job to find technical resources, whether we're technologists ourselves or someone coming with a non-technical background. It's important to have someone or multiple people on our team or as resources that we can lean on. So this might be a technical advisor or a mentor or a co-founder, but having somebody in that seat that's able to help guide some of the technical decisions and the technology roadmap that impacts our company is critically important at all stages of our company's development. Now, in the early stages, it's okay for us to kind of not have a super clear technology vision, but we need to make sure that we're choosing technologies in a way that we're able to um, change or pivot in the future without a whole lot of rework or future technical challenges. Now, if you're a non-technical founder, I think it is valuable to have some understanding of how does technology look like? What does it look like in the organization? How does it play out in what it is that our company does for our customers? Now, you don't necessarily need to know at the lowest levels how to program the applications that serve our customers, but it is important, I think, to understand what role does technology play and what are the different pieces that kind of come into it. Now, one of the big things that I see a lot of founders and companies struggle with early on is this idea of if we build it, they will come. Meaning that if we build a software package that we as founders feel like the industry or the world needs, but we haven't actually spoken with our potential customers and found interested customers that are willing to engage with us and are willing to ultimately pay for what it is we build, it can completely destroy a company. If we're building something that companies or customers are not willing to pay for or doesn't solve their needs, then we don't really have a company at all. We just have a fun technical project that we've worked on for a number of months. So in the earliest stages, I always encourage founders to make sure that they have customers that are willing and able and excited to buy the products that we're building from a software standpoint. This can be one of the harder parts of figuring out what it is we're building, is making sure that what we think our customers will buy is actually what they need, will actually solve a business problem for them. Now, some common myths, especially around technology, that I hear from both non-technical and technical founders is that we can save a lot of money by just hiring either junior or mid-level or offshore developers. And that can save us a lot of money in the early days. And while that may be true, we have to be careful that we're not, that we're hiring the right resources so that we are getting something built that will actually help serve our customers. Another big myth that I see is that folks will overbuild, that they're building for Google scale, that they're building for Netflix scale. And in the early days, unless you're Netflix or Google, you really just do not need to be building for that level of scale. So it's important to only be solving the problems that are right in front of you and not be over engineering as a way to try and be the next technology revolution. Another area I've seen founders and companies get tripped up on is always adopting bleeding edge technologies. Now, unless it's a differentiator for your organization, adopt the boring technologies. Adopt the technologies that have been in the industry for 5 or 10 years, that are battle tested, that have really proven themselves in production environments. If you're adopting a lot of bleeding edge technologies, you might be very limited in the functionality that they provide. You might be adopting a platform or a technology that could go away in 6 months. And if your entire business is built on that technology and that technology goes away, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. So it's important to be careful about the technologies that you choose to adopt into your organization. Another common myth, and you'll hear this a lot from the business perspective, is that everything needs to be in real time. It needs to have absolutely no downtime. In reality, these things are just not true. There's a lot of leeway with how we can propagate data through our systems, or how fast users need to get certain notifications or actions to be taken. Now, we still want our systems to be fast, but when we are trying to develop a true real-time system, the complexity and the cost can be astronomical, and it really is not often a very big differentiator for our organizations. You also don't need a fully functioning app to sell. You don't need to spend 9 months in the basement with a team of engineers building something before you bring it to market, before you bring it to customers. This is where it's important to make sure that you're building with customers in mind. You're always having that conversation. You're always asking those questions of your current and future customers to make sure that you're building towards something that that solves the need for them. As technologists, we're always excited about adopting and using the latest and greatest technologies. But what's important for our businesses is to focus on solving those real business problems. And oftentimes they look like every other CRUD application. They look like a series of input boxes that are entering data into a relational database. They tend to not be that exciting. But for our customers, they can be game changers. And that is what's important to always focus on, is our business customers. And another a common one I see, especially from non-technical founders, is that they need to have a technical CTO, co-founder at the helm from day one. And that's just not true. There are a lot of non-technical founders that have had great success in working with interim or fractional CTOs. Someone in a senior kind of technical leadership position that is able to lay a solid foundation, put the frameworks and the guardrails in place, and then bring on additional contractors or junior or mid-level engineers. But you just don't need to have a technical co-founder out of the gate unless you have just an incredible relationship with someone. That's something that I encourage founders to really hold off on until they find that perfect fit for their organization. Now, throughout this, please jump in if you have any questions or thoughts. If your experience differs from anything I'm talking about, I would love to hear about it. I want to dive into some questions and provide my answers next. So this is a good opportunity if you do have any thoughts at this stage to jump in. Again, either in chat or raise your hand. Either one's cool. All righty, hearing nothing, moving on. So one of the big questions I get from founders is, should everyone know how to code? And this is where I give my classic "it depends" answer. And so I will usually answer this with yes and no and maybe. So if you are a non-technical founder, there is value in understanding all what goes into creating software. What does it mean to use a framework or a programming language? What does it mean to deploy something to a cloud environment? What does it mean to use a third-party API? Having an understanding of all the different pieces that kind of play into creating software can be really beneficial, even for non-technical founders to understand, so that they can be a part of the conversations as they happen. Now, I don't think it's important for non-technical founders to really dive in and learn how to code unless that's something that you really want to do. unless you really want to learn how to code. Now, you can certainly teach yourself how to create a simple application in, a week or two, maybe a month. But really, most business applications can get very complex very quickly. And if you don't have a lot of experience or background, you could be putting yourself in a bad position by trying to build something that you might not have the experience or expertise in. Now, if it is something that you're interested in learning how to code, there are a ton of free resources out there. YouTube is a fantastic resource for learning how to use new frameworks or software architectures, how to leverage platforms like Heroku or AWS. All of those are fantastic resources that you can dive into for free. You just have to invest your time to sit back and learn. So I do think it is important for everyone to know what goes into creating software, but not necessarily how to do it themselves. Another question I get a lot is around choosing a technology stack. So starting to get a little deeper in the weeds here. When I work with companies and founders, engineering teams, as they're choosing their technology stacks, my typical answer is to choose, again, the boring technologies. Boring is Node.js or Python. It's Postgres or MySQL. Technologies that have been in the industry, have been battle tested, have a lot of community and documentation around them, are great technologies to choose. Now, if your company is doing something that does require bleeding edge technology, then that's where we start to explore other options and opportunities. If you're focused in ML or AI, then you're going to need to explore newer, more bleeding edge technologies. But again, it's important to evaluate those based on what it is you need for your business. As far as technologies go, if it's not a differentiator for your business, then I encourage you to find a provider, find a vendor to give that functionality to you. User authentication is a fantastic example here. Unless you're building a platform that allows users to integrate login and log out functionality, it's not worth your or your engineering time to build that. Fantastic platforms like Auth0 or Okta provide login, log out functionality. They handle all of the other things that you're not going to think about. It's just not worth your engineering time to spend in developing some of those. This is where we have to be careful, because engineers love to build stuff, even if something out there already exists, because we want to figure out how it works. But if it's not a differentiator for the business, don't choose not to build those things in-house. Now, other areas that I like to look for when choosing a technology stack is, how is it being adopted across the industry? Are there conferences for the particular technology? That's a great way to kind of get a gauge of how impactful, how well adopted is a technology, is if there's a conference for it. If there's a lot of community and support and documentation, then you're going to be in a much better place than if you're choosing a technology that doesn't have that same level of commitment from the community. Now, unless it's a differentiator and you need high performant code, choose something that's going to be a little bit more boring, that will allow you to find engineers from all over the world. It's much easier for me to find a Python developer than it is for me to find an Elixir developer. It's much easier for me to find a Go developer than it is for me to find a Rust developer. And so if I don't need some of the benefits that those languages or frameworks provide, then choose one of the more boring technologies as a way to really move us forward. Now, one thing I do like to do is to build most of my tech stack on one of those more boring technologies that it is easier for me to find engineers that have experience. And then if I do need something that has high concurrency, that has the ability to handle unique use cases, then that's where I'll lean on one of those technologies. But for the most part, most applications don't require that. Also look at other companies and what are they hiring for. This is where I love to look at job boards to see what are companies looking for in engineers. When they say they're looking for someone with 3+ years of experience that has React and Node and AWS experience, it's likely that I'm going to have an easier time hiring. And so when I'm choosing technologies, it always goes back to, can I build the thing that I want to build? And can I hire somebody that has experience in those technologies? Now, some technologies or frameworks might not be the coolest. They might not be the fastest. But if it solves a business problem, then it's probably going to be okay for you. Now, I've seen and worked in organizations that have had 10 million users running on a single relational database, running on a Heroku instance. These applications can be built, they can be performant, and they can scale with large numbers of users, with large feature sets. You don't need to adopt complex technologies or architectures early on. You see this a lot with the microservices versus monolith debate. Now, there are times where microservices do have a benefit, but if you're adopting microservices just because everyone else is adopting them, or because Netflix or Amazon uses microservices, then you are not focusing on the right things. You're adopting technology because it's technology and because it's interesting and cool, and not necessarily because it's what you need for your organization and for your customers. I always go back to, what is it that my customers need? What challenges do they have? And how can we develop software to help solve some of those problems? Does anyone have any questions around technologies, tech stacks? Anyone have any challenges that they have faced when selecting technologies? Now, I've certainly chosen the wrong technologies on more than one occasion. Yeah, Scott.
Brian, actually, you started to go down that path there. You've chosen the wrong technology. What? Give me an example, or kind of illuminate a little bit why you felt like ultimately you felt like you chose the wrong way to go.
And sorry, I missed part of the beginning there.
Yeah, that's okay. You said you maybe you have chosen the wrong technologies in the past. I have certainly in my experience, boring is good because it is tested and so forth. Are there, what have you learned, or can you give an example of picking the wrong thing, and what, as someone going down that path, you see it's wrong, and you want to try to see that it's wrong as soon as possible so you can course correct.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So, from your perspective, you said you have picked the wrong technology. What did that look like from your perspective? What were the warning signs, I guess?
Yeah. So a recent project that I worked on, I inherited a technology stack that it was early enough in the project we could have shifted technologies. But I looked at the framework and said, okay, no, I understand it is industry adopted. There is a lot of community around it. I reached out to colleagues who have used that same framework in production applications, and they said, yeah, no, it's great. So I didn't do enough research and deep dives early on in that particular framework. And what I started to run into was not necessarily the framework itself, but how can I get out of the framework? And especially things around integrating with like authentication libraries, right? I needed to add a SAML integration into the application. Now, the framework sits on top of Node and Express, but the framework made it very difficult for me to try and get out of, to get, remove myself from the framework and the way the framework wanted me to do things and get down to those lower level technologies. And it was kind of at that point that I needed to spend more time figuring out, is this the right framework? Is now a good time to kind of cut my losses and say, okay, there's a lot that we've learned. There's a lot of code that we can, ideas and functionality that we can borrow and bring into, but it may be an opportunity to do not necessarily a ground up rewrite, but a fairly large refactor to move ourselves away from the framework, because the framework wasn't providing any value anymore. It was actually becoming a hindrance, and we were getting tripped up by the technology, by the framework.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think sunk cost really comes into play a lot. I think when we choose some of these technologies and we feel like, oh, well, we've already invested 6 months into this technology. Let's just keep pushing forward. Let's just keep pushing forward. And what happens, I find, is that we build up more escape hatches to get around certain functionality that's not supported by a framework or by a technology. And at the end, we end up with this kind of cobbled together mess. And if we had just been able to kind of stop and go a slightly different direction, then we would have been maybe in a better place, and really I see this kind of play out more and more as you're adding more developers to a project, and you can't just say, oh, we built it in Next.js, right? We built it in Next up until this point, but then we started to get hindered by the framework. So now we had to go in this different direction. And so new developers coming to the project now need to understand not only how does the industry do it, but now how does this unique project, this team, work within it, and what are the nuances and the tribal knowledge that's required for a developer to understand that technology and how it's being used. That can be pretty challenging and frustrating for new engineers coming into a project too. Cool. Anyone else have other questions around choosing a tech stack, or if you're evaluating certain technologies now? So one other thing I will say here is I think it is important to spend some time in like a research phase as you're evaluating some technologies, and really come up with all of the use cases that you can imagine you may need to solve for with a particular framework or language, and see if that language supports it. So this is where, instead of just trying to build out a simple hello world application and, oh, can I communicate with a third-party API, really diving into it and try and solve some of those use cases that you identify early on, spending that week, maybe 2 weeks ahead of time, can really save you months in the later on down the road. So really trying to make sure that you're as aware and as have as much information going into a project as possible. Cool. Another question I get asked a lot, and this is more around should I use a development agency? And what should I expect from a development agency? But really, what should a dev agency provide? And so for me, I think this happens in a few different phases. So if you're um, maybe starting a new project, or you have an existing project that you want to add a new set of features to, and you're saying, I either don't have the resources in-house and I want to take this to a a development agency, a freelancer, a consultant. What does that look like? And so I think there's a few phases here. The first phase is, I think it's important for the development agency or the consultant to ask a lot of questions up front, right? This typically looks like a discovery is a lot of how often it's presented, but just making sure that the development agency understands the business that you're in, the problem that you're trying to solve with software, and addressing the correct problems with that software. Because if we're not careful and we just ask a dev agency to build something for us, they're just going to build us exactly what we ask for. But if it's important to make sure that we're building the right thing early on, because if we tell a development agency to build something and they spend 6 months doing it and they send us a bill for $150,000, $200,000, and at the end it's not what we needed, it's not what we were looking for, and it's not what's going to solve our customers' needs, then we're out all of that time, all of that money, and we're much less likely to engage in a similar project in the future. So I like to see development agencies that will spend some time up front getting clear on the requirements for a particular set of features. I also like development agencies that will push back and say, hey, what if we change direction? If we don't have this full feature set that you're asking for, but maybe 80 or 90% of a similar feature set, but we can deliver it in a third or a half the amount of time, then that's a lot of value for the business. And it's certainly information that I would want to know about if I were making those decisions. Now, I also like to ask development agencies, after we are clear on the requirements and they start to develop, what is it like to add a new developer to the project? What is it like for me to try and deploy what you're building to a new environment? When we understand, when development agencies focus on adding new users or adding new environments, it typically means that they're architecting the platform in such a way that it can be added to, that it can be extended. Typically, that means that it has better testing built in, that it has better documentation built in, that there's configuration and portability is in at top of mind as they're building out the software platform. So a few pros that I like to call out if you're considering or already working with a freelancer, a consultant, an agency, I kind of look at them very similarly. They can bring in technical experience and expertise. This is a great way to find subject matter experts. If you have something unique in your business that requires you to have a subject matter expert, this is a great way to find someone, but not necessarily be concerned about hiring them full time. Now, some cons that I see in engaging with these groups is they could choose the wrong tech stack. They could choose something that they're interested in, that they think is interesting and cool, but may not be something that you can continue to develop on easily. You see this a lot with proprietary frameworks. A lot of agencies want to bring in their own framework versus what is kind of tried and tested in the industry. They can also disappear. So this is where it's important for you as the business, as the founder, to retain ownership of everything throughout the process. And what I've been surprised by is the number of founders that will just be completely hands off when it comes to working with some of these agencies. Everything from their domain names to their hosting is all managed by the development agency. And if anything were to happen in that relationship, then your entire business could be gone. Your entire software that you've spent months and thousands of dollars building could be completely gone because you no longer retain control. So I always encourage founders and tech leaders to make sure that you're retaining control over the code, over the hosting, over things like domain registration. And then a couple red flags that I usually call out. Yeah, if they're hosting on their platforms, I discourage that. Using anything proprietary, only bringing their developers. I look for consultants or agencies that are willing to work with, say, I have a team of engineers and I want to just engage with a development agency. I want them to be able to work well together. Other things that I look for, local development environment. How easy is it for me to get the software up and running locally? This is where I look for things like Docker and Docker Compose files to give consistency and automation to the process. I look for fairly extensive unit and integration tests. If it's well-tested code, more often than not, then it's better written code as well. It also gives some level of comfort as we're adding and extending the software if we have good test coverage. And it's a heck of a lot easier to put in good test coverage early than to try and bolt it on later on. Is everything well documented? Not only how to get new developers added or adding new environments, but also is the code base well documented? Is it easy to understand and to explore? Are there things like database fixtures, right? Can I easily stand up a new database? Can I easily seed it with dummy data in a development environment? Are they using things like ORMs? And I know this is a bit of a debate, but most applications are better served if they are using something like an ORM that is an industry standard. Again, not something that's proprietary, but as a way to make sure that things like database queries, database schemas, and models are much more consistent. And again, all of these kind of do have caveats. Is there a CI/CD pipeline? How do we deploy something from our local environment? What is that process? Does all code go through a code review? How many people are reviewing code? Are engineers able to push directly to environments? Those are all things that I want to know about if I'm evaluating a development agency or a consultant. Does anyone have any questions around development agencies? I know a lot of companies and founders will use agencies early on to build out their platforms. All right. Another very, very common question is, what about offshore? And I know over the last, good question. Should I get a development agency to use GitHub? Yes. GitHub or some other source control. So GitHub, GitLab are typically the industry standards there. Yes. We want all of our code to be in source control. This is another piece that I would encourage you to maintain ownership of, and you create a user group for those developers that you grant access to, but you retain admin rights to your source code. Now, I've seen projects where the source code is completely stolen and deleted, and the GitHub account is deleted. And if you're not in control of those things as a founder or as a technical leader, then that's completely gone. And, hopefully somebody has it locally is your best case scenario. I've also seen databases get completely wiped out, or somebody holding on to database passwords or keys, API keys. So be very careful about ownership there. Good question. And not only using GitHub or some other source control, but pipelines, CI/CD, or some well-defined process for reviewing and deploying code is also really important there. Now, offshore is another great way to get development resources that may not be in your local area. So I've had the opportunity to work with folks from India and Latin America and Eastern Europe, right? Ukraine, Poland. Just there's some amazing developers out there that have a lot of great experience and knowledge that can really empower your team to develop software. Now, what's really nice about some of these using offshore resources is, yes, it can be cheaper to find great senior engineers or folks with experience for a lower cost than what we might see in like the UK or the US. But it also gives us the advantage of working with time zones. And if I'm able to work with a group out of India or out of Ukraine, then they can be working when I'm sleeping, and I can be working when they're sleeping. So it gives us much better coverage and being able to continue to push projects forward. Asynchronous communication becomes incredibly important here, but it is a great opportunity to be able to develop for more hours of the day if you're leveraging different geographies. There is a much bigger talent pool. Again, I've worked with a number of engineers and teams that are just fantastic, that have experience in many of the same technologies or in new technologies. So this is a great way to really bring that expertise in-house without having to hire someone full-time. Now, some disadvantages to working with offshore resources. There can be language and cultural differences. Depending on where the developer or the group is located, you're going to have different challenges. You're going to have different things that you need to consider around cultural norms and the way communication happens, how to effectively communicate with different groups. But that is something that can be overcome. Time differences, if you're working with a group that's 7 or 9 hours ahead of you, then you need to plan your schedule accordingly to be able to have some sort of overlap to allow for handoff of information. And then, like working with any other developer or group, quality control is another area that we have to be conscious of. There are a lot of great offshore resources out there. A number of years ago, that was not necessarily the case, and it did require quite a bit of oversight. In my experience, that's not the case as much anymore. You are getting really good quality software that meets the needs, meets the requirements. it's produced pretty quickly too, which is great. It is important to try and find a reputable agency. There are a number of agencies out there now that will bring together a group, and you're able to then engage with the agency and say, hey, I need a React developer senior level that can start tomorrow. And there are agencies that are able to provide that. They manage all of the payroll, they manage all of the currency transactions, all of that is handled on their side, and you're able to then bring somebody in-house. Now, what's also really nice about some of these agencies is if you do find a developer that you really enjoy working with, you can offer to bring them on full-time into your organization, which is a great way to build out your team, but test a developer before you hire them full-time. Now, if you are considering offshore, a few questions that I like to ask or be aware of, how often and in what ways are we going to be communicating? If there's a big time difference, we're going to really want to have a lot of great asynchronous communication. Does that happen through Slack? Does that happen in shared Confluence documents? Where does that happen, and how often should I expect to engage or interact with those developers? Hopefully I'm able to work with the same person throughout the process so that the knowledge is shared, that I don't have to, bring somebody new up to speed all the time, that we're able to have that consistency throughout the life of the project. And then, like any working with any group, offshore or not, I do think it's important to have a way to report and resolve bugs. Bugs will happen in software. Let's make sure that we have a way to efficiently and effectively report them, document them, and then solve for them. We don't want them to get lost out in the ether. All right. So now we do have probably about 8 or 9 more minutes. If folks do have other questions, I would love to take any of them. I've got additional questions here that I've received from founders that I can go through, or we can wrap up. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions that they might be encountering?
I was going to ask something.
Sure.
Well, I'm a software engineer trying to found a company right now, but I'm having this question the early stage of the software design where you don't know if following, for example, clean architecture design or domain-driven design is making you slow to the changes that you need to make to your product on early stage startups. So in your experience, do you think like a slow and clean approach is still better like a fast and messy, or at which point, like the abstraction is making you slow to achieve a product market fit?
That's a good question. I like moving slower if we can, and really thinking about cleaner architecture, because it makes it easier in the future for us to change that architecture if we need to. All right, so a good example of, let's say we're starting with a monolithic application, but we start by implementing a modular design so that all of our functionality is encompassed in a module that if we needed to, we could pull that module out into its own service. Versus if we had just a bunch of services that all kind of lived together, they were all kind of intermingled. There was no clear delineation around the the domain that each service or area of the code served, then it becomes much more difficult to start to pull those areas apart if we needed to scale, right? So you see this a lot when companies are going from a monolith to like microservices or more of a modular monolith architecture. So you might feel like you're moving slower now, but if you can afford the time, do it now versus later on. But you do have to balance over optimizing now. So this is where coming up with some good structure and consistency in the code base can be valuable, but don't spend a ton of time building the perfect class abstractions that will allow you to just inject new components. This is where I think we focus too much on like things like dry code and that sort of thing. Early on, it's not worth spending that time. It's okay to have some copy and paste. Excuse me. But it's also valuable to keep track of those decisions. So that's where I like to look to things like ADRs, architecture decision records, to say, hey, we did this for this reason so that I don't have to remember it. And then in 6 months or a year, we can go back and we know why we did it and we know what that looks like. What does that encompass? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure. Any other questions? Anything that you're experiencing, and it doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about already today, but just in general.
Maybe I was also going to ask, have you met like any tech stack where it isn't able to achieve clean architecture design? Like the old technologies like JavaScript and Java, they're always able to achieve this. But for example, I know about Ruby on Rails where you need to follow conventions. Is it like a good example about Ruby on Rails that it isn't a good tech to be chosen because of that?
So I am, it's funny, I'm working on a Rails application now. And part of it is it was originally built as a monolith, right? That's how Ruby on Rails wants you to build things. And that it is possible to create clean architecture with something like a Ruby on Rails. You are saddled with the framework, right? So Rails has a way of doing things, and if you don't follow the Rails way of doing things, then you're going to have a hard time. But they have made it easier to have concepts like internal modules where we can encompass some functionality as a module, and that module it looks just like another Rails application. So there are ways to kind of encompass or design around a domain within a framework like that. But it can become limiting over time. That is definitely a very, very opinionated framework. That if you go against the framework, you're going to have trouble. But I don't necessarily, that is a framework that if you have experience with Rails or have engineers that have experience, it may be worth exploring and looking at. Again, I've worked on applications that were built in Rails as a monolith that have 10 million users and tables with 400 million rows. And it's not that, uncommon or crazy. There's a lot of companies and applications that were built on Rails. So if it's easy for you to get started and fast for you to develop, and you're able to keep it fairly clean, then go for it. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Cool. Just a couple more minutes. Any other thoughts or ideas? So I'll leave you with this. I'm sure you may have seen me on LinkedIn, or we may already be connected. If not, I would love to get connected and learn more about what it is you're building. I love to see new companies and technologies and architectures. That's super exciting for me to dig into what teams are building. And if I can help, the QR code on the right there is takes you directly to my calendar to schedule a free 30-minute conversation. If there's anything within your technology stack that I can take a look at, whether it's architectural diagrams or processes, code reviews, whatever, I'm happy to dive in and help out there. So I would encourage you to schedule some time with me if that's valuable for you. And then I'll just leave another minute or so for any last minute questions. And if not, I really appreciate your time this morning, and look forward to seeing you out there.
Thank you so much, Brian. This was a very interesting topic. I learned a lot.
Awesome. Glad you were able to attend. Thank you.